see people are joining. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes as everyone filters in from the last session, and then we'll get started.
Great.
For everyone joining, we're just giving it a minute or two as everyone logs in, and then we'll get started. Perfect. So thank you all for joining us for today's session, and welcome again to Spokes 2020. I've been listening into a lot of the panels today, and they've been fantastic. I hope you guys are enjoying them as well. So I hope you're ready for our next session. But before I introduce your moderator, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. As you're joining, you should see a quick poll question on your screen. If you'd like to submit an answer, please go ahead and do so now. Secondly, please note that the views expressed here today by the speakers are their own and not the views of their organization. And then last but not least, as all the other sessions have been, we do hope that this session will be interactive. So please submit any questions that you may have via the chat feature in Zoom. And to make it a little fun, we decided to do first 5 participants to submit a question will receive a t-shirt. And moderating today's session is Eric Davis, who is a partner at AGC Partners. So I'm excited to welcome you, Eric. I'll turn it over to you to do introductions and to get started.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our panel on privacy investing. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Eric Davis. I'm a partner at AGC Partners in our security and privacy practice. We are a Boston-based technology investment bank with offices across the U.S. and in London. This is our 17th year at it. We've advised now on nearly 400 M&A and growth equity transactions in this time, including 116 in cybersecurity and data privacy, which by our count, I think makes us the most active in these segments over this period of time. Of note, we've closed now 4 deals in the post-COVID era, so it's great to see deals still getting done, even in this era of unprecedented volatility. We have a great panel for you today and some of the leading investors in the segment. I'll ask them to introduce themselves momentarily, but just for everybody on the line, we have Alex Ferrara from Bessemer Venture Partners, Scott Frederick from Sands Capital Management, Aaron Jacobson from NEA, and Andy Jenks from Drive Capital. So with that, perhaps Alex, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off with some introductions, and we will move on from there.
Yeah, sure, Eric. My name is Alex Ferrara with Bessemer Venture Partners. I'm a partner of BVP, joined in 2005, so I've been there for about 15 years, had been a software engineer for many years prior to that. We are about $2.5 billion fund, about $6 billion of capital under management, mainly focused on Series A, Series B rounds of investments. We've got about 60 investors and offices in California, New York, Boston, India, and Israel. And I'm part of the security team, spending most of my time focused on cybersecurity, enterprise software, SMB software, but our firm covers a wide range of sectors.
Great, thanks, Alex. And Scott? You're on mute there, Scott.
Classic start. Yeah, I'm Scott Frederick, Managing Director at Sands Capital. Really appreciate you guys having me. Sands is a little bit of a unique animal in that we truly, a lot of people say that they're stage agnostic, but we invest all the way from the seed stage through to the public markets. We manage about $50 billion. And the one constant is growth. We like to say that we do all things growth. So we were a seed investor in Wirewheel. Other companies you might have heard of were one of the top 10 shareholders in Okta. We were at one point a very significant shareholder in Palo Alto Networks and Splunk. So security and privacy are near and dear to our hearts. And in terms of me personally, I've been in venture for about 24 years as an investor and an operator. So that's me.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Aaron?
Hey everyone, and thanks to Justin, the YWheel team for having me. I'm a partner at NEA. We're a global venture capital firm, investing primarily at the early stage, but our large fund size allows us to do mid to late stage investing. We have about 20 billion of assets under management, a fund size of 3.6 billion. I sit within the enterprise team of NEA based out of the Bay Area, but we also have offices in New York and DC as well. My primary focus within the tech team is really on infrastructure software that covers everything from privacy to cybersecurity, AI, data, as well as automation and robotics. Pretty much anything that is not an application but helps you build, manage, or deploy applications.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And Andy?
Hey, everybody. I'm Andy Jenks. I'm one of the general partners at Drive. We have roughly 12 investors at Drive, and manage current assets under management is about 1.2 billion. We're considered a startup, I guess you could say, in the world of venture. We are investing out of Fund 3, and we do invest across multiple stages. So we do seed stage investing. So our smallest check size can be $1 million. Our largest check to date so far has been 50 million. So we'll participate from early stage through the growth stage. And our kind of mantra or thesis and the way that Drive kind of looks at the world is it used to be that you needed to put your capital next to your talent, so engineering talent that was highly concentrated on the coast, like typically Bay Area, Boston, Seattle, et cetera. And now our thesis is that you need to put capital next to the customers, and the entrepreneurs will find the customers. And so we want to be that capital partner that supports those entrepreneurs that are next to those customers. So our typical investment geography is between the coasts, but we do also invest on the coasts as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy, and thanks again to the panelists. I wanted to start out perhaps discussing some of the broader trends within privacy investing. I think many of us are deep in the field, and so it'd be no secret that there's been nearly 20 billion invested into security and privacy companies over the past 2 years. Now, that's a very broad category. It encompasses everything from endpoint security to managed security to cloud workload protection. But it's undeniable that privacy platforms have contributed more than their fair share to this total. Just to name a few of the large deals over the past 12 months, we saw Big ID do a 50 million Series C last September. Privateer did 40 million Series B in June of last year, and then followed that up with an 80 million Series C earlier this year. TrustArc did a 70 million Series D in July of 2019. And then OneTrust, they came out of the gate with a 200 million Series A to 1.3 billion valuation in July of last year, and then followed that up with another 210 million earlier this year at more than double the valuation, 2.7 billion in February. So clearly there's a lot of momentum, not just in the broader security market, but more specifically within privacy. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like if each of you could speak a little bit about the key drivers you're seeing around this investment interest, and in particular, what has been your primary thesis as you have looked to increase your investment activity in this subsegment? So again, Alex, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric. We led the Series C, the 50 million round at Big ID last year, and then another investor came in and put even more money into the company a few months later. I think in terms of the thesis and the drivers, I really come at it from a cybersecurity angle. We were finding about 18 months ago, I was walking the halls at RSA, the big security conference in California, and we observed that the volume of data breaches that continued to occur was just alarming, right? I mean, these data breaches were growing in volume and severity at a time when cybersecurity spend on technologies to prevent those data breaches was at a record high and growing. And so we kind of came to the conclusion that spend in protective cybersecurity products was necessary but not sufficient. And what was really needed to address this issue of data breaches and leakage was thinking about the problem in a very different way, which we kind of thought of as re-architecting privacy engineering within enterprises. And so we started, instead attending conferences like the IAPP conference, where we learned a lot about, not only the regulations in play, but also some of the best practices or principles for, for application development around minimization of data collected, around being able to comply with consent management. And we realized that, today or 18 months ago, it was a very manual process, and that there was a real opportunity for automation. And I think that's been largely the trend we've followed, which is there has been a soft catalyst in the form of GDPR, a more substantial catalyst in the form of CCPA in the US, and maybe an even larger, final catalyst in these data breaches, which really threaten, the kind of the sanctity of these major brands, Equifax and others. And we sort of said, okay, well, there's going to be an opportunity to use software to automate and improve the processes needed to improve privacy engineering and eradicate this kind of privacy debt, as we called it, within enterprises. So that's kind of been our angle.
Great. And Scott, how are you seeing the space? What's been driving your interest?
Yeah, well, at a firm like Sands, at our scale, we need to look for massive problems and opportunities. And the other thing we always look for is, what's an inside angle? And I particularly like being involved in this panel because with Wirewheel, it goes back to a personal friendship with Justin. I actually knew Justin when he was at the Department of Commerce and helping the U.S. negotiate a number of the international privacy regulations. And I still remember a conversation where he was basically kind of telling me, throwing up his hand saying, these regulations just don't mesh. It's going to put Fortune 500 and even smaller companies in an untenable position. And that kind of started a discussion on, wait, this should be something that software can step in and help solve, as well as automation. So, that's a little bit of just kind of fun. How did we come to Wirewheel and some of our views on privacy? But not unlike Alex, I think most privacy investors, we started with more of a focus on security. They're both very compliance-driven industries. And to me, I view a lot of that as unfortunate, but it's because they start to behave a bit like a public good with externalities. The consumers aren't able to read, all the fine print of all of the companies they engage with. And so regulators and lawmakers need to step in. I think if I were to think of a way that we're different here, it's that we really want to focus on that back half of the chessboard. Who can win long term? And so for that, we then look for who's going to build a sustainable product platform as opposed to kind of a one-off Band-Aid solution. Because in a lot of compliance-driven markets, that's what happens. You get these little, feature sets pop up and they claim to be companies, and they kind of create a lot of issues in the signal to noise category. So for us as investors at the scale that we invest, we're really looking for those companies that have long-term solutions and platforms.
Got it. How about you, Andy? What's been driving your activity?
It's interesting because prior to joining Drive, I was an entrepreneur, and I had started a company in the governance, risk, and compliance space. And I saw firsthand as an entrepreneur the challenges it was, even being a governance, risk, and compliance platform, going into other countries, dealing with data centers, needing a data center in Germany and a data center in London and a data center in the US, just to be able to handle all the sensitive materials that went back and forth for that business historically. And then what I started looking for, in this world that we live in today, there was starting to be a little bit of backlash against, on the consumer side, all of the data that was being collected and then how that data was being used. And the best thing for us to look at, or me personally, I kind of tend to live more in the B2B world, is to see how that would impact the businesses. So I actually I backed into the security aspect of this by looking for kind of that governance platform, found a company in DC that was doing it. And actually Justin, and meeting Justin at RSA maybe 2 years ago when they won the Innovation Sandbox Award was my I wouldn't say my first, but my kind of like aha moment of collapsing the cybersecurity plus the privacy piece, and really seeing how those two things work together. And so how I'm looking at the market today is I'm looking through. I also lead our security practice here too, so I'm looking through this cybersecurity lens as it relates to privacy. And I'm on the board of a company that is one of the companies that we didn't announce it yet, but it's called Immuta. We just raised a $42 million Series B because that cybersecurity aspect of this has really accelerated. I wouldn't say it's changed the conversation. It's accelerated the person who can ultimately buy, and that person has budget and being able to allow them to grow. So that's the way I'm looking at it.
Got it. And Aaron, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so like the other panelists, I also look at it from the perspective of cybersecurity. And if you look at what one of the biggest problems is in cybersecurity today, it's talent shortage. There's simply not enough analysts, not enough sophisticated talent to solve all the problems that CISOs are facing. Now you got to think on top of that, due to GDPR and CCPA and additional regulation, we've now dumped a whole bunch of additional requirements on top of CISOs where they have to now build out privacy teams to meet all those regulations. And if you look at privacy, there's also a talent shortage as well. Not only that, there's also a budget shortage. Even if there were the people, they couldn't spend an unlimited amount of dollars to solve all these privacy problems. So the only way we're going to solve this problem is through software. And the only way we're going to make up for the lack of talent is by building software that makes the people who are in the industry more powerful. So we've really approached it with a similar lens as investing in cybersecurity, which is how do you leverage automation to solve this problem? That was actually one of the primary reasons we invested in WireWell. We are one of the earliest investors to back Justin and team because of their understanding of automation and processes and how it's all about how do I meet the requirements while not requiring organizations to hire a bunch of additional talent. I think if you look at something like WireWell, I mean, they take the cost of a consumer asking for a request to get all their data is typically like $1,400, and through their software, they effectively make it free. And so when it comes to solving this privacy challenge, businesses, they're looking at, how do I automate a lot of these processes? How do I automate the tasks? How do I make the existing privacy teams more powerful? Get more bang for my buck out of the existing investment I have because I can't make more in an investment than that. That's where our focus has been.
Yeah. So do you see regulation and compliance as a key driver of activity here, or is it the consumer? I think about when people talk about the consumer and privacy, sure, we have a lot of regulations. When we see Facebook share information with Cambridge Analytica, we see a lot of angry tweets online, but then what happens? Facebook's user count goes up by 4%. How many of us, even with greater regulations around data collection and usage, still just blindly click on our consent just because we want to get going on our surfing activity? And, we're all relatively sophisticated when it comes to cyber and privacy activities. So do you really see more of a business to consumer angle here? Is it really more of a regulatory angle, either today or going forward? How do you really see that shaking out? Now, pose it to any of you on the panel here.
I can.
Who wants to take that? Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I could jump in really quick. I think that this is a big challenge, quite frankly, for the way that I'm looking at the market. As I said before, you have to really understand, like, on the consumer side, like, what do people care about? Like, who really cares about their privacy? What behavioral changes are being made on the consumer side to be able to deal with their privacy, taking control of that, right? I just drove down to the beach and saw ads everywhere for DuckDuckGo, right? Which is a privacy-based search engine versus Google, right? So like really thinking about that piece of it on the consumer side. However, myself, I'm looking at it more on the business side, and I'm looking at it as, the regulatory environment absolutely drives change for sure, but you have to really have that company that's going to be impacted and what are those drivers that are going to impact them, whether it's bottom line, whether it's somebody's going to jail, whatever it may be. And that tends to be really where the stick is. And so, we are focused, and I am focused much more on the B2B side. However, I will say I'm really looking for that company that can figure out a way to tap that consumer behavior, because I think that there's a massive opportunity there. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know, if it's an approach of, you have all of your credentials locked in a box, wire wheel style approach. Like, I don't know what some of these things are. But I can tell you that, like, right now, at least the lens, there's a pretty, it's not easy, but I would say that there is a lens and a pattern that you can follow, saying the businesses, the B2B side, the enterprise side is where the revenue is. And so you can have these companies starting to generate that revenue and to be able to impact privacy globally. And then, but at the same time, like, I'd be really excited and am looking for and would love to find that kind of consumer-based company. But I think it really is going to start with the consumers caring a lot about their own privacy. Right now, I'm not sure where people stand with that.
Andy, I think that's well said. I mean, I think in the short to medium term, it's all going to be driven by regulation and compliance. Just look at the relative number of users between DuckDuckGo and Google, and it tells you, how much consumers value the privacy on that angle. Or maybe it is how hard it is to actually get that message across to the consumer. I went to law school a good 24 years ago, and I can tell you in those 24 years since, I haven't read a single privacy policy from beginning to end. No, I don't bother because I know I can't negotiate it. And I'm also somebody who has probably 80 to 100 apps on my phone. So there's no way I'm going to read them all and negotiate them. And I'm a relatively sophisticated user. So I think that really underscores the problem. And that's why in the short to medium term, it's going to be compliance and regulatory driven. My biggest concern there is that then I didn't do a very good job of articulating it in my first response, but that tends to foster too many very short-term Band-Aid-like check-the-box style approaches to a technology problem. And so it can it lends itself to a lot of inefficient spend. Over the long term, I'm an efficient market believer, and the better long-term solutions will win out, but it takes some time, and the consumer is hurt and a lot of money's wasted in the interim. But Andy, I agree. I'd love to start seeing some of these technologies take a more consumer focused approach, but it's going to be really hard. And I'm not convinced it sells or that the consumer's willing to pay for it.
I think I generally agree with all of that. I think, consumers generally don't pay for security products, let alone something in privacy, and generally instead rely on regulations to protect them and their elected officials putting those regulations in place. That said, I do think there's a segment of the population that does care about it. And I think, I have a portfolio company called Dashlane in the password management space. They help, store passwords and payments information and other consumer identity information. And I mention it because they have seen customers asking for more capabilities around privacy. And it causes me to wonder whether part of the issue is that, there really just isn't, there is no product in the market today that makes it easy for consumers to get a handle on the privacy aspect of their information without having to compromise other areas, whether it's time or money or, and so forth. And so, if you ever, as an example, go to like Facebook or Google or some of these sites that do, in theory, allow you to have more control over, on Facebook, who advertises to you, as an example, it is very difficult to go into that interface and select like which advertisers, should have permission and which not. Not surprisingly, they do not make it easy, right? It's there. In theory, you could have a lot of control over it, but it is not easy. And I tend to think that there will be an opportunity for a company that makes it very easy to almost operate as an autonomous agent on your behalf and interface with all of these platforms and other brands that you do business with to be able to have more fine-grained control over how your information is shared. It just, nobody's yet come up with something that's easy enough to for the consumers to use.
And I think there's some events on the horizon where we could, these are the types of issues where you can get a consumer zeitgeist going and things can change pretty quickly. I thought it was fascinating to watch big tech out of the Valley respond to kind of facial recognition policies just in the last couple of weeks. I think that's a fascinating trend. And it gets a little bit to this idea of the expectation of privacy. And maybe just younger consumers, especially when online, they just don't have a significant expectation of privacy. But it changes significantly when you start talking about where did you go, what stores and streets did you drive on. And so, as investors, it's incumbent on us to think, years out. And I think it's that real world data and actual human location as opposed to a virtual location that might trigger the zeitgeist to get people even more involved in managing their own data.
So like the rest of the panelists, I similarly believe that, I'd like to hope there may be some consumer phenomenon that will drive increased awareness and one among consumers for privacy. It really is being driven at the regulatory level. I mean, consumers emotionally want data privacy. If you ask anyone here, do you want Facebook to have unlimited access to what you're buying online, to know, where you're living? And the answer is going to be no. I think I read a survey like 4 out of 5 Americans think there needs to be some laws in place to limit access to personal data. But the issue is that's a very emotional decision, but consumers don't have the ability to cooperate and collaborate to actually enforce that, which is what the government's there for. Emotionally, consumers want it, but they don't have the power because, one, a lot of the choices consumers make are limited. I mean, how many other social networking platforms are out there besides Facebook? If you really want to buy something and have it delivered to you tomorrow, your only choice is Amazon. And so the only way we're going to actually get what consumers want embedded into large companies out there is through a regulation. But I think therein lies the opportunity in that we're increasingly seeing consumers let their voice be heard, and they're no longer willing to stand for things that violate their privacy, violate their own principles. And I think privacy, we started to see a bit of a movement over the past couple of years where there's an opportunity for businesses to differentiate themselves by focusing on privacy. I thought it was an interesting watershed moment when Apple ran a campaign for their recent iPhone, really focused on privacy. It wasn't about the new camera, it wasn't about any of the new apps. It was that Apple's committed to privacy. And so I think we're increasingly going to see an opportunity for enterprises to differentiate themselves by appealing to that emotional desire of consumers that want privacy, but they need to work with companies that give them the software, help them put the processes in place to build that trust with consumers.
Yep. So, we've been referencing privacy as sort of a monolithic idea right now, at least so far in the discussion, but as everybody on the call knows, it's a very varied segment, right? And there's a lot of sub-segments underneath it. We have companies that focus on data inventory, data governance, workflow productivity, consent management, a few other categories as well. And these are just the established categories today. Within these sub-segments, what areas are driving the most interest from you? Where do you think we're most ripe for disruption or user need today? And as you look into the future, what are some emerging categories where you think we could be investing more or really see some user demand on the horizon?
I'm happy to take that. I mean, we've actually published this privacy stack, we call it, which is our attempt to make sense of the various technologies that we think are going to be needed in this market. And rightly or wrongly, our view has been that the foundational layer, the bottommost layer, but the most important layer in the beginning of this market development has been data intelligence, and that's actually why we invested in Big ID, and there are other companies out there that are active in this area too. But and that's largely because as we went out and we talked with privacy professionals and data officers, we consistently heard that as they come into these jobs, the first challenge they face is they often don't know where the personal information or personally identifiable information is. So they started an enterprise, and they realized this enterprise has a massive number, sometimes thousands of data stores that store structured data, unstructured data, on-premise, in the cloud, in Salesforce, so in a chat log where some customer gave their credit card number or social security number when they shouldn't have. And and the first challenge becomes scanning all of this and having some intelligence around where does the risk lie, and then how do you classify it and pull it all together. And then going up from there, we see other layers of data governance and cataloging, and then some of the application layers where you see consent management and being able to manage DSAR automation, or a de-identification, and using in some cases encryption technologies to be able to kind of share data in an encrypted fashion with third parties. So we kind of start with those data management layers on the data infrastructure side, and think that more of the innovation over time that will move up the stack, because you really need these foundational layers, we think, before you can do an effective job of delivering the applications around consent, effective consent management, sharing of the data, and so forth.
Yeah, as I said before, the initial way we approached investing in this market is really focused on the cost. I mean, how do you enable enterprises to achieve compliance without solving thousands and thousands without hiring thousands and thousands of consultants? And we focused on automation as the first way to do that. Once you've actually put out the fires, once you've given businesses the ability to comply and understand what data they have, I think the second part is how do you actually unlock the value and the potential of that data without violating compliance? And this gets into some of the earlier investment opportunities we're looking at around, how do I share data securely while maintaining privacy? How do I do computation on top of data that may be anonymized? How do I do computation on top of encrypted data? And so some of the areas of interest to me at the early stage are things like, whether it's fully homomorphic encryption or differential privacy. Leverage, how do you feed data into, how do you train AI and ML models with privacy, with data, without violating privacy, or letting consumers know that their data went into training a specific model that a business now may be profiting off of. So I see that as much more earlier stage, and really the second part of the whole privacy wave. But the first part is just understanding what you have, automating to make sure that that you're actually getting to compliance and all the policies are being effectively enforced.
Yeah, I mean, for us, or for me and Drive, and kind of the way we're looking at it is very similar to Alex. We have a market map that we built all around privacy and stuff, and it's kind of like a stack in a very, I'm an engineer background, and so I think about everything like a stack. And we started with that layer of protection, if you will, and then we started moving up, and now we're starting to really think about the cloud itself, and how, again, there's single sign-on, there's other really great companies. I think Big ID is a great example of an awesome company that's gone super deep on something that's a big problem. But now applying that to the cloud, as you think about applications getting built in the cloud, there's all kinds of stuff getting spun up all the time in Amazon and Google and Azure, and who has access to it, and what data is being passed back and forth, and how do you manage all that stuff. When you have an on-premise data center, you can use on-premise tools. When you have a cloud data center, sometimes those on-premise tools don't map right to that cloud. So I'm thinking about the world that way. If you believe that some applications will get built, some applications will get built in an Amazon-only environment. Some applications will get built in a hybrid environment. Some applications will remain on-premise. How does that world kind of all integrate together? And I do think it starts with control and being able to control who has access. How can you revoke privilege? How can you do that? And then Aaron mentioned something that I would say that I had overlooked early on, is the meshing, if you will, of legal and engineering. And I can remember when Matt at Amuta told me that he was hiring a lawyer, as an engineer. And I was like, wait, why are we hiring lawyers as engineers? And this whole concept of differential privacy and the way AI takes people's information and what you're giving that AI, whether it's a bias or whether it generates a model that has those biases, and being able to map all that back to be able to show exactly how something was built, why, when, how, all that is another area that I think is super interesting as well.
Yeah, Eric, I'm not sure I have that much to add to that. I really kind of view the world very similarly. I mean, I'll give Alex props for his model. I think one of the reasons I view the security landscape that way is he's done a very good job of mapping it. So if you haven't checked out his map, check it out. But then what we do on top of that is try to think, what are some of the, kind of edge cases, or, where might the future opportunities be? And Eric, I don't know if you want to jump into that already, but related to something Andy and Aaron touched on, I think the idea of synthetic data is fascinating. And this kind of falls in the bucket of just risk minimization. And I don't know if folks have ever heard Sunil Yu, excuse me, from Bank of America speak, but he has a really interesting view of security, which is basically you almost have to assume that you're going to get breached. And so the only real defense is to make sure that the value of the attack is, the long-term value of the attack is zero. And the way you do that is you spread out your data so much that when they get to something, it has no value of its own. So along those lines, we've been looking at federated machine learning, I think is a fascinating opportunity. And then synthetic data kind of goes hand in hand with that. When you think about how often sensitive information gets passed through your organization, and then think how many of those times did it have to be the real data? It's pretty amazing. And so, we haven't found the company that we love so much to make a bet in that space yet, but we are looking in both those areas, and they're related.
Mm-hmm. So, correct me if you view otherwise, but the way I see privacy today is still relatively nascent, and companies have been able to thrive focused on their unique individual silos. I compare that to the early days of cybersecurity where companies could do the same. And what we've seen in cyber is as security stacks have grown to 75, 90, 100 different tools within one single company, there's been a real push by the CISOs to move to more of a bundled approach. Where do you see privacy going down the road? Will companies continue to focus on an individual silo and perhaps get what they need through greater integrations and partnerships? Or do you think that in order to thrive, there's going to be a need and eventually a consumer demand to bundle so you have one company that really does a good job across the data inventory, the privacy workflow management, consent, et cetera?
I'll jump in there. I'm a believer that these things always go in cycles, and you kind of vacillate between best of breed and one throat to choke. I think we're so early in the privacy market that we're still absolutely in best of breed. Security, I'd say, is more mature, and CISOs are starting to push back, and they're going in, more towards the one throat to choke. I think we've all heard these stories of CISOs getting over 100 vendor emails a day. I mean, it's daunting. All you have to do is go walk the halls at RSA, and it's sensory overload. But privacy, I think, is still much more nascent of a market, and so it'll be best of breed for a while, is my gut.
Yeah, I'm like Scott. I mean, we're in the let 1,000 flowers bloom stage of the market, where tens, hundreds of companies are getting created to solve pretty specific problems. And I think a lot of those problems have runway for companies to build $100 million plus revenue businesses. I think it's only once we get multiple companies being over 100 million and the laws mature, companies' privacy strategies mature, that we'll start to see more demand for privacy suites, which is exactly what happened in cybersecurity. But that being said, even if you look at cybersecurity today, there are companies which look at cybersecurity as we want a best of breed, and we have the team and the ability to buy the best of breed solutions to assemble the suite that we want. And if it costs more, we don't care. But then there's a group of customers which say, We actually want to do as little as possible, check the boxes. And so we want to buy a suite that's cheap, that allows us to meet our cybersecurity needs, and that's it. So even years down the road, even once you start to see some consolidation of privacy, I still think there'll be opportunity for best of breed solutions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, nothing much to add, just in agreement, 100%. I think that best of breed for now and I think that the best of breed winners today are going to be folks that know the market the best, right? So I think that that's why a company like WireWheel does such a good job, because Justin just knows, like, he just is a credible founder, knows exactly what to go build, and he's going to build best of breed, right? And so I think that companies today, that are there, that are building best of breed, will have a strategic advantage, for the next couple of years.
Great. Alex, looks like you're in agreement.
Yeah, I think it's well said. It's all well said.
Yeah. So let's think a little bit now about potential convergence between privacy and cybersecurity going forward. There's obviously very natural synergies. We're seeing them today between privacy tools and security products like a CASB, DLP. I think Aaron, of course, mentioned encryption, or Scott did. Do we see potential deeper integrations and single platforms across privacy and cyber going forward, or do you think those are going to remain two distinct categories?
I'll take that. I do think there's a movement towards both security as well as data, and I think part of it just comes down to the fact that the budgets for privacy today are smaller than that of security and that of data. And so I think a lot of these vendors that we had, that you sort of see in these maps in the broader security and broader privacy space, as well as in security, are starting to move more towards the data budget. And it makes sense, because a lot of the problem really is a data problem, right? And I think it does tie into what's happening in the data infrastructure world around, and we've already talked about, data governance and cataloging and so forth. So, if the privacy budget today, I don't know exactly what they are, but let's say the market is a few $100 million, and it's growing at a nice pace. The data infrastructure market is $30 billion, or something along those lines. And so I think, it's just natural for a lot of these vendors to gravitate more towards, security and data. And I think you'll probably see some, combinations, some M&A and combinations of businesses in those spaces in order to kind of capture more of that spend.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to see increasing integration between cybersecurity and privacy tools. The main reason being, I don't think cybersecurity teams are aware how much risk they actually may be in terms of fines or brand damage from data leaks and from some of the cybersecurity solutions that they've actually deployed. I think a good example is the largest fine under GDPR to date has been, I think, over $200 million, and it was against British Airways. And it was actually because of an attack on their website, which ended up leaking a whole bunch of customer data. Now, if you're the cybersecurity team, you would look at it and say, well, we have our WAFs in place, we've got all the web security in place, we're checking the box, we're doing best of breed, we're doing best practices. But had they added a privacy lens on top and understood, well, how much data could actually be leaked? What are the identities that could actually be leaked? Assuming that this metadata is leaked, what could we be fined for? I think that they may have budgeted or put a lot more efforts, particularly into that part of their security stack, but they didn't, because I don't think they understood the privacy implications.
I think it comes down to data. I think that if you think about to Aaron's point earlier when he said, you've got not enough people trained on this stuff, right? And the data is the risk, right? At the end of the day, it poses both a risk, whether it be GDPR or whether it be somebody getting in and stealing your bank account information and your cash, right? You've got risk in data, and I think that anywhere you have data and you have that risk, you have to shore it up. And traditionally you do that through the front door, right? The windows, make sure the windows are locked, the doors are locked, all that other good stuff. And in this case, you know, the data can get out in other ways, you know, through errant sharing of it, or you know, again, potentially even the front door, right? But that data piece of it is really, really important. And for a security engineer to understand the security aspects of it, you really need to pair that up with somebody who understands on the data side the risk from a privacy perspective on the, you know, the implications to the business itself. And so, you know, for me, I look at that and I see these two worlds starting to converge. And some of the smarter companies that I've spoken to, at least in the past, are trying to get somebody with that lens to privacy and risk inside of the security operation. But again, that's few and far between today. But I do think that these things are going to start coming together more.
Agree 100%.
So we have. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Oh no, I agree with everything that was said.
Great. So we have roughly 5 minutes left. I thought it might be interesting in our final minutes together if each of you could speak a little bit about what's on the horizon a little bit more. We talked about some of the segments we were focused. We started to touch upon areas that you think are ripe for automation. Obviously, you have AI coming in, and that is both potential driver of success and privacy, but also potential risk as well for challenges to preserving privacy. So, you know, what are some of the challenges that you anticipate? How are you seeing new regulations impacting the segment? What are some of the opportunities? You know, I know that's a lot to cover in a very short period of time, but you know, what gets you out of bed in the morning when it comes to privacy?
You know, I'll give my quick one, or it would be, it was kind of mentioned already, but I do think there's this, there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, and even the questions, right, this, you know, the tension that exists between, you know, privacy and AI. And I think, you know, Andy and I think Aaron also touched on this kind of topic of what we kind of think of as ethical AI. It's, and Scott as well, you know, the idea of, you know, in this new world, you know, you need to, you've got this tension that exists because large enterprises recognize the value of AI and machine learning as a mechanism to drive business value. It's a top priority for most CEOs. And yet now you've got these heavy constraints in the form of, you know, requiring consent to use customer data for AI and machine learning and so forth. And so figuring out that problem, you know, how do you use the data in a compliant manner and in an ethical manner so that you know that your models are not biased, you know that you're not putting your customers at risk if there's some de-identification attack. I think that's a really interesting problem that is yet to be solved. And there are approaches of, Scott mentioned federated AI and machine learning, which I think are promising. I think, Aaron also mentioned, homomorphic encryption or partial homomorphic. There are all these different, approaches. There's, secure multi-party compute. And I think that's a fascinating area because it both is, it's a challenging problem. I think it can unlock a tremendous amount of business value, whichever solution ends up working. And at the same time, I'm pretty skeptical because, as we've looked at many of these companies, especially in areas of partial homomorphic encryption, it's just there's a tremendous amount of risk. There's still a lot of what I call like science risk in that, the underlying approaches often, don't yet really work or aren't proven to work at scale in a commercial environment. And we don't mind taking product risk, being able to convert something, into a, convert a product, create a product that works in the market. But, oftentimes we don't love taking like the science risk of, does the math, in its current advanced state really work to get these solutions, into market. So I think that's just one we're excited about and tracking and really actively looking at and meeting companies and smart founders in those areas.
Great. Let's see, where should I go here? There's so many different directions we can go. Agree with what Alex said. I mean, I got a kick out of his mentioning math. It's one of the issues with the synthetic data space is their justification of the science involves really hardcore math. And I've had discussions with entrepreneurs. It's like anytime your sales deck, needs to rely on complex math to prove that you're doing what you're doing, you're in trouble. Because the number of buyers that can understand the math is, it's a very small set. what gets me excited is, these are just very real issues that we as a society have to solve. And it's also just a tremendous business opportunity. I think the federal and state legislation is going to continue to come fast and furious. I live just outside of DC, so I'm probably a little bit more plugged in on that front. But even at the state level, New York City, Maryland, Massachusetts, there's new legislation on the docket, and it's going to make it that much harder for large companies, and that much more important for them to have an appropriate software solution. And then I'd say one last thing that I've been just noodling is we've touched on this idea of kind of CISO overload, of a signal to noise ratio, and way too many vendors. And I look at then other parallel markets, and I'm fascinated by what companies like Atlassian and Twilio have done in the DevOps space with what I'd call a bottom-up sales motion. So I've been spending some cycles trying to think through what are the opportunities or ramifications for security and privacy of a company taking that sort of approach. And again, it's those sort of intellectual riddles that make our job fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it's explainability, which Alex touched on. AI today is heavily a black box. And if we're going to have AI and machine learning increasingly making decisions for us or for our businesses, you bet we need to understand how those decisions are made to make sure there's not any underlying biases. Another area of particular interest is really, it's at the melding of privacy and healthcare. I think this was a challenge even before COVID with contract tracing. There's just so much incredible data out there at the health level, but how do we actually share that and get it into pools in private, secure ways so we can actually do precision medicine at scale, discover new drugs, discover new treatments. That's just, there's a whirlwind of opportunity there, but it's challenging because of regulation, because of the sensitivity of the data. I haven't seen anyone crack that yet, but the company that does and figures out how to build those data sharing networks, it's going to be huge.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I was just going to mention that I've been spending a lot of time with our healthcare partner about talking about healthcare and privacy and security and how it all relates together because of precision medicine and because of the different ways in which you want to be sharing data, your own data, especially on the medical side, and around drug discovery. So for us, or for me, and us on the healthcare side, that's a big part of what we're starting to kind of really dive deep on. And then this whole notion, and everybody already said it, I think I wouldn't call it obvious, but I would just say that, like, if you spend enough time in the space, it becomes obvious that you need this layer to understand the AI. Because I've talked to out there companies of AI building AI, right? You've got this meta situation happening, and who knows where that stuff comes from. So this notion of whether it's synthetic data or this really understanding of what's happening inside of these AI systems, I think that as a society, in order for us to take advantage of it, I think we underlyingly need to understand what it's actually doing, the inputs and the outputs, right? So.
Great. Well, I think we're bumping up against the end of the time here. Fantastic insights from everybody on the panel. Really appreciate it today, both the insights on where you're spending your time and where we're going in the future. So thank you again to the panel. Thank you to the participants, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.